We're excited today. We have a wonderful lecture today from Andrew Wymer, a dear friend and colleague of mine from the Brunswick Theological Seminary, where he serves as, so I gotta get it all. He is the assistant professor of preaching and worship, the director of the chapel, and the assistant dean of their doctoral studies at New Brunswick Theological Seminary. He did his PhD at Garrett Evangelical Seminary in Evanston, Illinois. He was also a postdoc fellow there. So we're excited to have him with us. He has a wonderful lecture on homiletic glances and whiteness from the pulpit. Andrew.
Thank you. Thank you for your warm welcome. Thank you to the seminary. Thank you to Professor Norton for your hospitality. Thank you to Dean Childers. Thank you to Jeremiah, wherever you are, for the ride last night, and to EK for the ride that you're going to give me. I need to say thank you to my seminary, New Brunswick Seminary. They allow me to travel during the semester, so we're also in the middle of our semester. And so I'm grateful for that. And then my students want to thank you because their classes are today and they get to meet online because I'm here. So if they were here, I think they would tell you thank you. So I've been invited today to lecture on the topic of whiteness. Professor Norton told me that some groundwork has been laid for, in a previous lecture, for the task of having this difficult conversation. So I'm going to trust that's there, and I'm just going to jump right in. So in this lecture, we have 45 minutes to an hour. Now, I know some Baptist preachers. I'm a Baptist, so I know some Baptist preachers who would tell you that it takes half hour just to get the plane off the runway. So we got to keep moving here. We're going to cover some ground, and that's partly why I've titled the lecture "Glances at Whiteness," because we're going to keep moving, and it's going to be a quick look and then moving on. So I'm going to present what I understand to be some unique perspectives arising from the field of homiletics, the study and the practice of preaching, and liturgics, the study and the practice of worship, that provide insights into critical interpretations of whiteness. So my concern in this lecture is twofold, and these echo concerns in my work. First is that those who benefit from whiteness must increase our awareness of and begin to take responsibility or continue to take responsibility for our whiteness and the whiteness of others, whether on the individual, institutional, or social level. And my second concern, not unrelated from the first, is that my work, that our time here must offer insights and hopefully even tactics for resisting whiteness, that the time here we must spend in a way that disrupts whiteness. Otherwise, this time could then be functioning as a misdirection away from and sort of enliven structures of whiteness. So in preparation for today's lecture, you read two pieces. I will reference them at several points, and my hope is that in reading those, we've at least come in with some shared foundational awareness, perhaps some shared terms. I'll give us a brief run-through of a definition of whiteness drawn from the Drowning in Dirty Water article that you read, and then we'll move on into some new material, but it'll brush up alongside of these, and I'll reference back to what you read, or what you were invited to read, at least. My task today is not to prove that whiteness exists. I'm not trying to prove that it exists. I do want to provide some initial definitions. These are again drawn from that Drowning in Dirty Water article. My colleague Chris Baker and I in this article sketch a foundation of what we call soteriological whiteness. We argue first that whiteness is, quote, a structure of power at work in the world. It is a non-material power and should not be overly personified, but it is a power that attaches itself to persons and groups of persons who then unjustly benefit from it at the expense of others, those racialized bodies deemed various forms of non-white. This is to say that whiteness is not biological. It is a structure of power that creates both domestic and international white privilege, which is a deceivingly pleasant-sounding term. Who doesn't like privilege? But that describes the plundering. the taking from of economic resources, of social status, of political power from persons, states comprised of people who have been deemed non-white for the benefit of those who have been deemed white. We talk in there about the ways in which this structure of power is materialized and attached to certain persons. It's inconsistent. We say it's historically contingent. Who counts as white, the grounds of which one is deemed to be white, are flexible and fluid. They shift. So no one is truly white. Rather, whiteness is fluid. It adapts. It adds, admits new blocks of persons as necessary in order to ensure its dominance. So there's extensive work. Perhaps some of you have read books that were on the New York Times bestseller list about, there's a book, How the Irish Became White. And there's work done about how Jewish persons became white. Originally considered racially inferior, considered racial minorities. How over time, whiteness comes under stress, and the boundaries of who could be white were broadened. And so these groups of people from immigrant communities learned to take their place in white dominance. And leaving behind their racially inferior status, and also leaving behind those other racial minorities. Finally, we argue that whiteness has embedded theological claims. And I'll talk later, I'm going to use this word of theologic, specifically as it relates to salvation. So whiteness intrinsically claims, quote, moral and ontological purity that merits and earns God's favor, unquote. Taking this a step further, I argue that the theological logic of whiteness, that white is pure, white is supreme, and because of that, white functions as a marker of the divine. And we're going to get into that in one of my, the last glance that we'll offer. And correspondingly, then, God, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit are re-envisioned in the white image. And of course, it's not a coincidence that white God, white Jesus, white Holy Spirit, guess who they love the most? White folk. The end result is that white space is functionally heaven. It's the white experience here on earth is functionally the eschatological kingdom of God. But you already know all that because you had the reading. So let's move on in and start glancing at whiteness from and in the pulpit. The first glance that I want to offer is revealed to us now. I didn't make the connection that I was going to be in San Francisco and talking about Colin Kaepernick. But Colin Kaepernick was playing here on the San Francisco 49ers. And this first glance, we can begin to see something. I'm going to connect to the pulpit, but start with Colin Kaepernick. He, in 2016, decided to remain seated during the national anthems that were played before NFL games. It was on the news, widely discussed. He said, "I'm not going to stand up to show pride in a flag for a country that oppresses black people and people of color. To me, this is bigger than football, and it would be selfish on my part to look the other way. There are bodies in the streets and people getting paid leave and getting away with murder," unquote. Kaepernick's protest, if you'll recall, though, was met with strong pushback. The NFL is still kind of reeling from this discussion. This discussion is really still ongoing. And even to the point now where he's alleging in court that he was pushed out and now withheld a job because of taking this stand. And we're going to keep coming back to Kaepernick. So if you're wondering what I'm doing with Kaepernick, we're coming back. But this problem is also evident in the pulpit. I teach prophetic preaching for personal and social holiness and justice. And I have to have a conversation with my students about how to preach prophetically without getting into too much trouble, or at least being able to calculate the trouble you're going to get into and to do so strategically. So homiletical disruption, homiletical protest also is often met with vehement pushback. I have colleagues, I have students, former students, who've lost their jobs because they took a stand about an issue of justice in the pulpit. So the hate and the rage that Kaepernick uncovered and that preachers can uncover in the pulpit can at least be partially analyzed through an engagement with anthropology. So that is the study of human societies and cultures. Many of you maybe had an anthropology course in your undergrad. Any hands? Yeah, usually it's common in the curriculum for bachelor's degrees. And particularly, I want to bring up practice theory. So practice theory is a part of, located in anthropology, and it's focused on examining what people do and how they do it, according to Catherine Bell, in Ritual Perspectives and Dimensions. In particular, practice theory is concerned with how power is constructed, how it's built, and then with how social relationships and hierarchies are negotiated through our activities together. Bell writes that practice theory suggests, quote, human activities as formal as a religious ritual or as casual as a midday stroll are creative strategies by which human beings continually reproduce and reshape their social and cultural environments, end quote. And it's due to this creative reshaping activity that I'm suggesting that Kaepernick got so much pushback and that preachers can get so much pushback. So the notion of practice should not be new to many of us. There are, I'm surely some practical theologians in the room, theologians of practice here at the school, practitioners, people who are doing practice, whether it be in a local parish context or nonprofit. Preaching and worship are disciplines in the broader field of practical theology. And practical theology, as I understand it, I'm thinking of liturgical theologian Dwight Vogel. In his Reader, he talks about theology of, as, in, and because of praxis. And you can actually flip it around as well and say practice because, of, as, in, and because of theology. As theologians of practice and practitioners, and as a theologian of practice myself, practice theory pushes me to be aware of these anthropological dimensions of Christian practice. So pushes me to critically engage the ways that all of our formal and informal practices, that's our human activities, the things that we do, have an implicit and explicit creative agenda, even if they're not aligned, meaning sometimes we don't do what we say. So it's important to note that these agendas are not just spiritual, but they are material. They have implications for social dimensions, economic dimensions, political dimensions. In an essay, Why the Idea of Practice Matters, James Neiman talks about practice as, quote, a constellation of actions that people have performed over time that are common, meaningful, strategic, and purposeful. He deploys this framework in relationship to Christian preaching. And I'm not going to spend time fleshing out each one of those. I want to zero in on strategic and purposeful. Neiman's terms reflect the awareness I already talked about in practice theory, which is concern for the way power is constructed and relationships are negotiated. So all practices, including preaching and worship, and the communities that engage them have an implicit and explicit agenda, which again may not be aligned. Practice theory provides us then with a sort of a critical tool to begin to identify and question these. So within Nathan's practical framework, the ethical significance of these many dimensions, or 6 dimensions that are listed when I gave you that quote from him, the ethical dimensions of preaching are intrinsically related to those last 2, the strategies, the purposes, the aims. He writes, the aims of a practice establish its ethics, the ultimate values to which excellent performance will be held accountable. So the rubric is determined by this aim, this goal, even if it's not explicitly stated as such. So this has 2 implications for Neiman. The first is that all of our practices have ethics embedded in them. So what are they? And the second implication for Neiman is that practices are never engaged for their own sake. We're trying to accomplish something in these practices, to do something as it relates to society. So then critically interpreting preaching as an ethical practice can lead to an awareness that the faithfulness of preaching, the rubric by which we judge the quality or the faithfulness of preaching, is not necessarily determined by its component actions, so like exegesis or theological analysis or exposition or application. This is to say that someone could exegete thinly, do theological analysis with little concern for God and or human beings, perform the sermon without dynamic care or energy, poorly engage all these necessary actions that come together to make the preaching moment, and still have a sermon that's considered faithful and acceptable as measured by this overarching goal of what's trying to be accomplished. So back to Kaepernick. Critically interpreting, so the practice in this instance will be the playing of the national anthem before an NFL game. So looking at that as an ethical practice suggests to me that the folk that were so angry were not concerned with the component actions of the practice, or at least these component actions met their underlying expectations, meaning the singing was okay. The flyover, it was just the right altitude. Not too loud, could see them, the planes were impressive. The cheerleaders, they look cheerful, so that's good. None of those things came up. What came up is, and what folk cared about was that a black man did not assume a posture of compliance and dared to refuse to engage in protest of manifestations of white supremacy in the USA. They cared then that Kaepernick went on and his actions encouraged other folk to do the same thing. So for those who were upset by this, practice theory makes me want to question this. What's going on here? Perhaps Kaepernick was violating an unspoken strategy or aim of this practice. Perhaps whiteness is unspoken aim embedded into the singing of the national anthem before NFL games. Perhaps that's why Kaepernick met with so much resistance. He was violating unspoken white strategies and purposes for racial domination, assumed to be embedded in the singing of the national anthem by some. So now this may not have been explicitly stated. Oh, the national anthem, it's patriotic. It's respect for our flag. Any number of things that could be said about what the goal is. But I think Kaepernick revealed for us some unspoken strategies for many people. So our strategies and our purposes are important. I argue that considering preaching as a practice must lead us to name, intentionally formulate, and then begin to question our strategies, particularly as it relates to race for the subject, for this particular moment in time. So we must question our implicit and our explicit agendas. What do we say we're doing? And then maybe we're not, maybe we're actually doing something else. Maybe there's more than that going on. Maybe these aren't aligned, what we say and what we do. Practice theory provides us this tool to start to critique these. So a consideration of preaching as ethical practice within the context of engagement of whiteness in the USA leads me to say all Christian preaching, all Christian worship, whether explicitly stated, consciously realized, or not, it has social, economic, and political purposes or aims complete with an agenda for the racial structuring of society that reflect and create the strategic vision of the particular community. So as Kaepernick's protest suggests, this is also true of practices beyond just preaching and worship, but secular practices as well. So if I'm correct here, we must name from the pulpit and in the pulpit our racialized agendas as persons, institutions, and as society, opening these up for critique, negotiating then these purposes, the personal, the institutional, the social, and trying to come up with something that's emancipatory for all people. This is particularly important for persons in institutions deemed white in the USA, for whom whiteness is our default racialized vision for the ordering of society. So defining whiteness through the lens of practice, whiteness is both an ideology of domination that is reflected in and even created in our communal and individual activities, and it is a social relationship of domination that is reflected in and even created in our communal and individual activities. So there are two contradictory dimensions here that I want to point out. The first is that whiteness as an ideology and political force is enacted, it's reflected and recreated by the actions, the communal actions of many, many people across the whole country, and even beyond if we start to consider whiteness in a global sense. So that's daunting. That's the sheer magnitude of the enacting of whiteness is almost overwhelming. How can we overcome this? But it also raises to my consciousness an awareness of the conditional nature of whiteness. It's a vulnerability as well. Just like skillful playing of the piano, whiteness requires consistent practice. It must be rehearsed, it must always be reenacted in order to remain dominant. I think of Malcolm Gladwell's book, Outliers, where he notes that it takes about 10,000 hours to become an expert, to achieve mastery in a field. And Gladwell, in that statement, reinforces what so many of us who were required to take piano lessons as children know. You can't just sit down and play and meet the expectations of your teacher without doing some practice. They can always tell. They can always tell that you didn't practice. So if you stop practicing piano or you don't practice piano, over time, either they don't form or your skills and instincts deteriorate. I played the viola, and I didn't practice for about 5 years, and my ear's gone. My bow hand is a little rough and bouncy. My fingers don't in tune as well. It starts to deteriorate. So in some manner, I'm saying that folks don't just sit down and play whiteness. For those of us deemed white, we've practiced whiteness for thousands upon thousands of hours since a very young age. I just saw some stats in dealing with early childhood education, a graph. And children, by even 1 and 2, are starting to pick up these cues of whiteness. A very, very early age. We've been rigorously trained in whiteness. We are virtuosos of whiteness. We cannot undo our learning. Once you've learned to ride the bike, you can't unlearn riding the bike. And we will always be virtuosos. Those of us who benefit from whiteness will always be virtuosos of whiteness. But we can start practicing something else. And perhaps over time, if we don't practice whiteness, we begin practicing something else, our skills and instincts in whiteness will start to deteriorate, and the fullness of our humanity might begin to emerge in the other theme that we're practicing. So if we wish for our practices to subvert whiteness, we must disrupt our practice and rehearse something else. We must continually raise to consciousness our racialized agendas. We must then formulate our racialized agenda and bring it into contact, necessarily into conflict with what may be the unspoken and unrecognized racialized agendas of white practice. This contact and conflict can be strategically managed in overt and covert ways. Now, I'm blessed to teach at an institution that has an explicit racialized agenda. About 13 years ago, our seminary was going through a time of conflict as it relates to race. And we passed this anti-racist statement. During the late 20th century, the seminary I teach at is Dutch Reform, so ethnically European, racially white. Our student body had grown to be predominantly black, but our faculty and our administrative staff was primarily white. And this led to tensions. But finally, we had a president come in, Greg Mast, who passed through the whole board and through a institutional-wide conversation, passed an official anti-racism statement. They put a full-fledged anti-racist policy into place, one which we are committed to ensure that the board, the administration, the faculty, and staff are intentionally shaped to reflect the diversity of our school. In addition, all of our policies are run through an anti-racism oversight committee comprised of persons drawn from a very diverse array of faculty, students, alumni, and such. Now, our institution still grapples with racism, but we began naming and rehearsing a different racialized agenda, one which we still need to continue to practice. And even though our anti-racist policy had, perhaps in some measure, what is still aspirational, it provided a fixed point against which we could measure ourselves and hold ourselves accountable. So finally, as it relates to practices, these provide us some cues for resistance. How do we resist and disrupt whiteness? Practices always entail power. Power is always being negotiated, created in practices. It would initially seem that whoever controls the practice controls the power, that they have all the power. And there's some truth to this. There's that aspect of control. But even the seemingly least important person in a practice has power. So look at Kaepernick. One man caused such a huge national uproar by recognizing and utilizing his power to disrupt. The NFL has now put into policies, though they're on hold while they negotiate them, to stifle such protests. But they're treading this fine line. It's forced this conversation into the open. Some players come to NFL games with different racialized agendas than perhaps the league, than perhaps some viewers. And they're trying to negotiate a way to express their racialized agenda during the practice of singing the national anthem before NFL games, their agenda of liberation and emancipation. So when participants encounter racialized agendas and practices that are different than their own, participants can choose fight or flight, or any variation therein. You can leave the practice, or you can negotiate your participation in the practice. You can organize, leverage your power as a participant. So I never preach longer than 15 minutes, and I never lecture longer than 15 minutes, and this is a long lecture. So what I'm going to do, and I don't see a clock in here, so oh, it's behind me. So I'm going to do a little dance off to the side and look back every now and again. But I want to let's take a second, collect ourselves. Do you have any comments, questions before we move on to the next glances at whiteness? Okay. Hearing none, I'm going to trust you that you don't have any. I'm going to move on. So the second glance at whiteness from and in the pulpit that I want to offer is a glance at a problem that I think is revealed to us, at least partially, in the political rhetoric of Donald Trump, particularly in his 2016 campaign. He was very skillful at saying just enough to render his racialized agenda very clear to certain supporters and clear to those whom his policies represented grave danger, but not saying so much that it created an uproar that would cost him the election. He navigated that fairly deftly. Now, to be clear, I do want to note that I think Trump's rhetoric shifted after the election in some ways. But the same problem of saying just enough, of coding, of silence, it's not only visible from the pulpit as we look out into this political sphere, but it's also visible in the pulpit. After Michael Brown was murdered in Ferguson, Missouri, I went to my white middle-class church, hoping to hear a word about racism, about racial justice from the pulpit during the prayers, but I was disappointed. The extent of the words spoken about Brown and Ferguson over the next few weeks were prayers for the unrest, I should say a prayer for the unrest, and accompanied by a prayer of thanksgiving for the police officers in our congregation. White silence, coded language about racism, they're not just a problem out there. They're a problem in here. They're at play in the pulpit. So now, I realize I'm going to mix metaphors here, y'all, so just bear with me, please. I'm talking about visual, glancing at whiteness, but now I'm making a shift for this one, and we're going to talk about listening and hearable whiteness, oral dimensions of whiteness. So stick with me. So whiteness as a sound. Homiletics is, among other things, generally an orally, it's oral, that's sonically projected from the mouth, and aural, A-U-R-A-L, that's sonically received through the ear. It's an oral and oral event in which meaning is negotiated through sound between multiple parties. Now, there are important exceptions to this, including the delivery and reception of sermons by persons with hearing disabilities, but throughout the history of church, this sonic dimension of preaching has generally remained uniform. So with this sonic dimension in mind, I want to connect the general sonic nature of preaching, the oral dimensions of homiletics, with the legacy of extensive and extended complicity of Euro-American Christian preaching, both globally in Western colonization, post-colonial domination, and locally in the USA in relationship to manifest destiny, the legacy of chattel slavery, the genocide of indigenous peoples, anti-immigration, anti-Semitism, Jim Crow, New Jim Crow, etc. So if preaching is generally a sonic event entailing the projection and reception of sound, and if preaching has been a practical vehicle for and even a source of whiteness, then might whiteness also have sonic dimensions? So my questions then are, can whiteness be heard? And does whiteness have a particular sound that we can listen for? So I argue in the context of the USA, a country that continues to be economically, politically, and socially dominated by white supremacy, whiteness can always be heard. Now, to connect whiteness to sound has the potential to be terrifyingly evocative. But of all the sounds of white domination, the sounds of the trauma inflicted over hundreds of years by agents, institutions, and structures of whiteness, and the traumatic sounds possibly heard in everyday life by persons in this room, I'm suggesting that the initial and primary sound of whiteness is disarmingly normal and mundane. So listen with me for a moment to the sound of whiteness. Can you hear it? Silence is the initial and primary sound of whiteness. So within science, silence is the absence of sound. But from the standpoint of homiletics, that's problematic. To speak of silence as absence, as emptiness, has the potential to misinterpret or even misdirect away from the ways in which during preaching and worship, silence is strategically organized around sound. It's laden with meaning. Sound and silence are intertwined, and they're strategically deployed in concert with each other. Silence, in a sense, is an unprojected sound that is just as significant, just as meaning-laden as projected sound. And perhaps you've heard the phrase, the silence is deafening. That's what we're talking about. In Silence and the Imperatives of Identity, Maria Luisa Chino-Loeb argues that the universal formation of human identity is always connected to selective silencing. We're complicated as human beings. We're complex. And so in order to form a singular identity, we must suppress or silence part of ourselves, aspects of ourselves, aspects of our bodies, and certain dimensions of our culture. This is crucial because it goes even a step further when it comes to racial identification. That entails further muting, the silencing of the fullness of our and others' humanity. She defines this dimension of racial identification, saying, from this perspective, we can see that race rests on systems of practices deeply embedded in silence in terms of both its experience and its analysis. In order to recognize racial distinctions, we must suppress what we experience of human variability and focus on the salience of traits we have learned to identify as markers of discreteness. We must also mute what we know of biology and genetic inheritance, about history and the flexibility of behavior as we have seen. So the imposition of race occurs hand in hand, that this occurs hand in hand with white supremacy is the imposition of race. It demands the silencing of the fullness of humanity, both of those upon it is whom it is imposed and those who impose it. So within the context of whiteness, which is dependent on the assertion of these racial constructs, silence is both a meaning-laden noun and it's a verb. So whiteness is silence, and whiteness silences. This is the initial sound and violence of whiteness. Before bodies are harmed, before blood is shed, before I can't breathe is expressed, racial constructs are deployed, imposed, silence the humanity of others. They allow the dominant society, the dominant racial order to cleanse its conscience, and then subsequently render those bodies deemed racially inferior as more accessible and vulnerable to domination. So silence is absolutely necessary to create and maintain structures of whiteness. A white society must be built upon the silencing of the humanity of others, and it can only be controlled and perpetuated through codes of silence, rendering the anguished sounds of the trauma of whiteness unhearable, at least to those who benefit from whiteness. A survivor of the Holocaust observed that, quote, the Holocaust will be understood not so much for the number of victims as for the magnitude of the silence. And I hear that within the context of whiteness in the USA, the magnitude of the silence. White supremacy, whiteness, understood not so much for the number of victims, but the magnitude of the silence. So whiteness in the USA is perpetuated to the degree to which persons deemed white are silent. They silence themselves and others. They maintain a wall of silence about the marginalization, the exploitation, the dehumanization, the extermination of non-white persons for the benefit of those deemed white. So the silence of whiteness demands that uncritically white folk never be honest about their racialized agendas. We can't be honest. So even as we doggedly pursue these racialized agendas, we must then make noise to distract. Many of you have perhaps heard of the use of dog whistle, the phrase dog whistle. Ian Lopez defines them in Dog Whistle Politics, his book, as coded racial appeals that carefully manipulate hostility toward non-whites. Referencing back to Donald Trump used dog whistles quite frequently in his campaign and still does. And then you read the article about white bullshit. White bullshit as an attempt to escape recognition and acknowledgement on the part of ourselves and on the part of others of the ways in which social structures of whiteness create and maintain vast disparities in access to social status, economic resources, and political power. So these are oral, sonic camouflage for whiteness. That they're always organized around the meaning-laden silence. So I am arguing that any projected or unprojected sound on the part of Euro-Americans or those who benefit from whiteness that either codes whiteness, misdirects away from addressing whiteness, or is even simply silent about addressing whiteness is an act of violent silencing and whiteness. So why is this notion of whiteness as silence significant for preaching? This is a really complex definition. I'll put in a plug for my book. It's going to come out in a year or two. Read the book and you'll know more. But I'm going to bring out two things that I discuss in the book. And the first is that within the field, at least the field of white homiletics, and as it relates to ethics, and here I'm thinking of Charles Campbell and I believe it's The Word Before the Powers, of where ethics focuses in on what's said. It focuses in on the words that are spoken. And it has not sufficiently interrogated the silences that are built in and around what is spoken. And this is problematic. Well, let me go first say, So there's that dimension, and then let me move on then. The second is that I argue that nonviolent theory has been misappropriated, misunderstood, misinterpreted. It's been appropriated into an ontological framework. When I talk about ontological framework, I'm talking about nonviolence as a way of being, sort of a life, a way of being, existing in the world. So it's been appropriated into this ontological framework by white persons, which is very problematic as it relates to the reality of white privilege. So, interpreted as an ontological reality, nonviolence suggests that it's literally possible for white persons to do no violence, exist in a state of not doing violence. However, I argue that white privilege is an act, it constitutes ontological violence, in which those who benefit from it are continuously taking from those, plundering, stealing from those who are deemed non-white. So even when us white folk do nothing, we sit here silently twiddling our thumbs, we still benefit from the racialized activities of our communal, institutional, municipal, state agents and institutions that enforce whiteness. Our doing nothing, our silence, must be critiqued. And I'm concerned, particularly as it relates to preaching, that we first expand our ethical scope to encompass silence, and then that we problematize any notion that white persons can exist apart from or pure of racialized violence against persons deemed not white. So listen for the silence. Even if it's noisy, listen for the silence. Listen for what is being camouflaged, coded, or perhaps misdirected away from. Silence is the oral counterpart of white inaction. So I'm thinking here of MLK Jr.'s famous letter from jail, noting the strategic and meaning-laden silence of the white moderates, the inaction of the white moderates. Silence and inaction can be the refusal to engage racism, the refusal to take a side, and the refusal to subvert or reverse the disparities and brutality of racism. White silence and white inaction are always violence in the context of racial domination in the USA. So if you've watched any protests, like Black Lives Matter protests or other protests, you see the slogan, silence is violence. Silence is violence. So what can we get out of this for resisting whiteness? I just want to mention a few, is that we have to disrupt the silence. You have to make noise, loudly disrupt, decode audibly, hearably the dog whistles, call out the white bullshit, make noise, refuse to be silent, but refuse to be silenced as well. Now, white silence is daunting, again, because the widespread nature of it. It's so broad. But I also want to just lift up that white silence is a vulnerability of whiteness. When confronted with noisy disruption, agents and institutions of whiteness naturally long for silence. They want to silence the disruption, silence the protest. Whiteness may react violently to those who are disrupting the silence. They may silence those voices, or whiteness may negotiate. White agents and institutions may negotiate for silence. They may make a few concessions to bring back the silence. But the sonic agenda of whiteness is always silence about domination. So the noisy silence of whiteness means that we cannot trust white sound. We must always demand action and material changes. So it's the primary task in my work that I view it's the primary task of woke white folk, that when white folk are silent, we must problematize that silence and accompanyingly demand specific and material changes. When white folk make noise, we must problematize that noise and silence the silence it hides if it does not include specific changes. So when white folk even say all the right words, even good words like racial justice, beautiful. Racial equality, racial diversity. If these are separated from specific changes, even these noble-sounding words can have a sinister function, serving to distract from and to hide whiteness and white inaction. So in the words of Jerry Maguire, show me the money. Actions speak louder than words. So hear the sound of whiteness and connect that to actions. Okay, so this is the end of my second glance, and I'm going to do the same thing that I did before. Let's take a moment, breathe. Does anyone have anything they want to throw out here, a question, a comment? Okay, we'll keep moving. We'll allow time at the end for some question and answer and discussion, and then there's time set aside for a group, small group, I'm not sure what the exact word that's been used for, but small group discussion. So this final third glance at whiteness I want us to look at is a problem, again, I think it is represented in the election of President Trump. One woman I read online last week wrote, "President Trump was elected by God," unquote. And I've heard numerous variations of this. I was speaking with a lady on the Southwest Chief, riding from Kansas to Chicago, and she said that her pastor had said that he, being Trump, is God's trump card. So tapping into that same idea. And each time I've heard something like this, Trump is God's man, the persons have connected that to the presidency of Barack Obama. Things were so bad, and now we have God's man. So I want to say that these are theological statements. That there is a logic to these, and that the connection between Trump being God's man and the presidency of Barack Obama being so bad are not a coincidence, that there's meaning there. So in A Black Man in the White House, Cornell Belcher, tracked the rise of racial aversion in response to the Obama presidency in key battleground states. So over 8 years, his data shows how white resentment increased in these key states. So his book, it was published before the election of Trump, but I want to say that this racial aversion played a role in the election of Donald Trump. God chose the white man to replace, undo, and correct what the black man had done. So preaching in the USA, like this political secular theologic, also has a long history of deployment using the same logic. Elevation of white bodies over those deemed non-white. At points in the history of this nation, black preachers weren't allowed to preach, weren't allowed to be ordained in white churches, or they were forced to preach under the authority and supervision of a white person. Black listeners of preaching were forced to be separate, in a separate section away from their white counterparts. This is, this logic is continued today, this theologic. Truett Seminary at Baylor has a center that widely publicized a survey that they took of the 12 most effective preachers. It's called the 12 Most Effective Preachers Survey. This was originally taken in 1996, and then they took it again recently. And it's supposed to recognize the 12 most effective preachers in the English-speaking world. In the original survey, it included 9 white males, 2 black males, and 1 white female. Now, oppression doesn't just happen along the lines of race, but that's what we're talking about today. But I hope your ears are also listening to other ways that this oppression is manifested. In the 2018 edition, it included 8 white males, 3 black males, and 1 white female. And I want to interrogate the theologic here. The implications of claiming that out of the 12 most effective preachers in the English-speaking world, that's a big category, a very expansive category considering the legacy of colonialism, that 3/4 of these are white mostly male, and residents of the USA. So the same theologic in claims that Trump is God's man is operative in the pulpit when we elevate white bodies over non-white bodies. So I want to just briefly explore this problematic theologic through the lens of sacrament, which I'll define in a moment. So we already discussed in the introduction how the notion of whiteness has theological and salvific implications. You may recall from my introduction where I spoke about how white God, white Jesus have been recreated in the Euro-American image, and by strategic implications, the imago Dei of white God, white Jesus are intentionally most visible in bodies deemed white. However, I want to take this a step further and argue that through whiteness, human bodies deemed white accrue sort of this heightened sacramental significance. So to talk about whiteness as sacrament. I argue that whiteness is sacramental in the sense that bodies deemed white are viewed as the preferred material through which God's action and presence are made real in the world. So before I spell this out, this line of reasoning, let me provide some initial definitions. By sacrament, I may be referring to particular practices. You read an article of mine and my colleague Chris Baker about a sacrament of baptism. But I'm also primarily using this to employ the term in a generic sense, a universal sense, which may encompass practices that have been understood to be sacraments, baptism, Lord's Supper, and others, but still allowing the possibility of identifying sacraments that either exist outside of the historical sacraments, perhaps even outside of the church, and even perhaps are practiced by those who identify as anti or non-sacramental. So as I've already alluded to, I define a generic sacrament as the encounter of God's presence and grace through the matter and material of this world. Simply put, we believe that God is present and active through material, through matter. So I'm also going to use the term idol. It was in the title of this lecture. Specifically in the framework of generic sacrament, idolatry is manifested when the matter of sacrament itself obscures the reality which it represents and enacts. This is what Tillich characterizes as demonic when he writes, "In all sacramental activities of religion, in all holy objects, holy books, holy doctrines, holy rites, you find the danger which we will call demonization." They, the symbols, become demonic at the moment in which they become elevated to the unconditional and ultimate character of the holy itself. So in the article you read, Drowning in Dirty Water, we argued that uncritically white baptism functions as demonic when it reifies white dominance and white purity, and in so doing it asserts an unconditional and ultimate character to whiteness. And in the case of the demonic sacramental idolatry of whiteness, I would also initially and conditionally define whiteness as an anti-sacrament. That is a matter that symbolically and effectually enacts evil in the world. So as an idol, as a sacrament or anti-sacrament, white flesh is the dominant manifestation of the imago Dei. Within this framework, white flesh, read Donald Trump, white male preachers, is the preferred sacramental material for encountering white Jesus and white God on earth. And as it relates to preaching, white vocal cords become the primary manifestation of white God's voice in the world. White bodies, or perhaps bodies deemed non-white but under the control of white bodies, become the means of bringing white God's word to life. White pulpits, white churches, white seminaries become the prestigious places where we can expect to encounter white God most fully. And white sacramental theology becomes the exemplar, or white theology in general becomes the exemplar and the standard against which non-white, non-dominant sacramental or theological perspectives are measured. So Christian sacraments such as baptism and the Lord's Supper, they have a long history of utilization in the elevation of white bodies over persons deemed non-white. Melva Costin has a book, African American Christian Worship, in which she addresses how slaves were forced to be baptized. They were functionally stamped by the church and brought under the realm of the Western church and governments. She describes how in New England, baptismal perspectives were changed in order to limit its ethic of equality and relationship with all, and to begin to enforce racial hierarchies. In her book, The Baptism of Early Virginia, Rebecca Goetz studies how baptism functioned as a practice that supported the enforcement and formation of racial hierarchies. So there's this long history. Now, when I teach my courses on worship, I have a diverse array of students, and not just racially diverse, but diverse in a wide array. Most of them belong to traditions that identify as anti- or non-sacramental to varying degrees. And I always teach them about sacrament by first talking about this generic sacrament. Can we all agree that God uses the matter of this world to be present and active in the world? And without fail, at least they say this in class. I can't tell you for sure what's going on here or up here, but without fail, we come to an agreement. Yeah, we all agree God works and is present in and through things, the things of this world. Now, we may disagree about what those are, but we agree that God works through these things. So we don't talk about particular sacraments like the Lord's Supper or baptism until we come to a shared agreement, a shared understanding. One of the reasons I do this is that the sacrament provides us with a diagnostic, a critical tool through which to analyze and interpret worship. Instead of entering a room and just assuming, well, that's the sacrament over there, or there's no sacrament here, to go into a room and to watch, look, where are the holy things? To seek out those operative sacraments. And this is important for ecumenical dialogue. It can bring us together on an issue that, at least historically, has been very divisive. It's also important because it's connected to then we can engage power. Where are the sacraments? Where are the holy things? And who owns those? Who controls those? Sacrament provides us a shared language to speak across theological differences. It allows us Baptists and other traditionally non-sacramental folk to enter into ecumenical dialogue, able to represent ourselves and what we bring to the table as just as important as those whose sacramental traditions are older and perhaps more widely respected than our own. And it's the same awareness of the sacrament of whiteness that I think can do the same thing. It can provide us with a tool for diagnosing both outside the church and inside the church. It provides us with language and critical tools to enter a space, to analyze through which material folk expect to find the universal, the unconditional, or the holy. Once we've identified that material, we can then begin to critique how encounters with that material are negotiated, boundaried, or even exploited. We begin to critique which material is elevated and which material is debased. In a sense, we can identify these secular sacraments and perhaps even secular gods. In doing so, we must then ask, who are the experts? Who are the authorities? Who are the people in control? Who interprets what we're doing? Who sets the rules? We must also ask if these sacramental materials are understood to be conditional and local, or if they lift up a universal and unconditional idol or anti-sacrament. So I believe this taps into broader conversations about theology. Who is God? How do we image or name God? How do we encounter God? And how do these rehearse or recreate systems of oppression and dominance, or subvert and erode systems of oppression and dominance? In order to subvert sacramental whiteness, we must first locate the symbols and the matter through which whiteness is understood to be encountered. And then we must critically engage them and the demonic, idolatrous, anti-sacramental vision of a God that they rehearse and recreate. This means that we have to deconstruct white Jesus, white God. We have to deconstruct European and Euro-American theologies that have imperialism and conquest embedded in them. The domination is deeply embedded. And so as we do so, we also can't just stop there. We have to begin to reconstruct. We must reevaluate, re-identify, relocate our awareness of the matter and the human matter in which we see the holy and through which we expect to encounter the real presence and action of God in the world. And this is an incredibly difficult task. And that is the end of my lecture. So I'm going to glance at the clock here. I believe we have 10:30 to 12, so we have about 5 minutes here before we break into, am I right? 5 minutes before we break into small group discussion. Comments, questions, observations? Yes.
I love everything that you spoke about, but could you also speak to not just the white discursive power over, in homiletics and in preaching over race, but the multi-layer intersections that queer people and queer people of color and differently abled people, that white discursive power over those intersections, and how it's racist and also violent toward these other folks as well.
Absolutely. And I tried to provide hints in there that I don't understand this to be the only expression of oppression, but it's the one we have to stay focused on for this. But I think that what we're talking about is transferable. I think the same silence, it relates to heteronormativity and the same agendas of all of our churches, our nation, our communities. We have sexualized and gendered agendas too, and other along other lines as well. So my quick answer would be that I think a lot of this is transferable because we're talking about oppression, and oppression is manifested in many different ways. Yeah, is that?
That's good. Yeah, I saw those other layers embedded into just white heteronormative discursive power.
And so you're drawing that, you're creating the web, you're showing the connections. Yeah. Okay. Yes.
It's just a small part too that, and that is that this is a conversation about race. So I'm gay and I can see those other structures. I'm a citizen of the Cherokee Nation, but I'm white for all intents as I function in the world, and the power that I get. So I'm wondering if is it better to just keep it focused on race, the conversation, as a way to dismantle it all, or include those? Because I'm feeling like I'd rather just talk about race, but maybe that's wrong.
So there's power in connecting, bringing it together. And I don't know your name. Yeah. You've alluded these are all connected. This is domination. So I'm thinking of womanist theology, which tells us to connect the forms of oppression. For the sake of this lecture, I understood my assignment to be to focus on race, on whiteness. And so that's where I've zeroed in on it, because 45 minutes to an hour is not much time. So that's why I made the choice. But I think either way, there's benefits, and there's things that can be lost. So the strategy I did was focused on whiteness.
Well, I wasn't referring just to your lecture, but I was referring more in terms of just having this discussion, this whole class. Because it seems like if we slip it, to me, and I could be completely wrong, I'm just trying to understand, if we slip into what happens to gay people or whatever, and again, I'm gay, proudly, happily. It seems like if we slip or go over there, silence gets created somewhere in there, a place to hide, maybe. I don't know, maybe not. Just sort of put that.
So I'm not here for the long haul, and you all are here for the long haul. I just get to run in and run out. So that's hopefully folk are listening, and that's something to keep in mind. Yeah. Okay, one more. Yes.
I just think that I really appreciate your talk, and I think everything you said was really very charged material, and I think that it's hard to hold that space, and to deflect from that is really an impulse that I can hear, but it's a really hard topic, and I think we need to stay on that.
Yeah, it's very intense, but if change is going to occur, we have to sit with this. We have to sit with the brutality and the horror and the uncomfortableness of it all. Yeah. Okay, so as I understand it, we're now going to go into some conversations, and you'll be provided with a case study. I don't know how you've divided groups, so I'm just going to trust the wisdom in the room to handle this. And
all right, well, if we can prepare to wrap up, we're coming to noon. We want to thank Reverend Dr. Wymer for his so you have, for next week, we have Rachel Schneider joining us from Rice University. We'll continue this conversation. You have a reading assignment, should be on Moodle, and we will look forward to seeing you all next week.